The withdrawal from Afghanistan has been pretty remarkable to see. The war lasted almost exactly 20 years, killed well over 100,000 people, destabilized the entire country, and cost us $2 trillion. But Afghanistan is just one theater of the United States' imperial war machine. It's a big step, to be sure, but the war machine rages on in other parts of the world. This is from a recent piece in Salon. He writes, quote, unbeknownst to many Americans, the U.S. military and its allies are engaged in bombing and killing people in other countries on a daily basis. The U.S. and its allies have dropped more than 326,000 bombs and missiles on people in other countries since 2001, including more than 152,000 in Iraq and Syria alone. That's an average of 46 bombs and missiles per day, day in and day out, year in, year out, for nearly 20 years. Now, you may think that most Americans don't know this because Americans are ignorant, but you would have to excuse those Americans because often even well-informed people in the highest echelons of power don't exactly know how many countries we're fighting in or how many countries we're bombing at any given moment. From that same piece, we don't know because our government doesn't want us to. From January 2004 until February 2020, the U.S. military kept track of how many bombs and missiles it dropped on Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria and published those figures in regular monthly air power summaries, which were readily available to journalists and to the public. But in March 2020, the Trump administration abruptly stopped publishing the U.S. air power summaries, and the Biden administration has so far not published any either. As with the human casualties and mass destruction that these hundreds of thousands of airstrikes cause, the U.S. international media only report on a tiny fraction of them. Without regular U.S. air power summaries, comprehensive databases of airstrikes in other war zones, and serious mortality studies in the countries involved, the American public and the world are left almost completely in the dark about the death and destruction our country's leaders keep wreaking in our name. Now, simply put, the United States government keeps a huge amount of its imperial adventures secret, hidden from the American people. This was the case when, early on in the Trump administration, 4 American soldiers were killed in Niger.
A helmet camera worn by one of the American soldiers recorded the ambush. 11 American and 30 Nigerian soldiers were returning from what was supposed to have been a low-risk patrol. After the shooting stopped, the camera was taken off his body and released as part of an ISIS propaganda video. The Americans tried to take cover behind their unarmored SUV. With one of the soldiers at the wheel, they ran alongside, attempting to escape the kill zone. They fired colored smoke, which would provide some concealment and identify their position to any friendly aircraft overhead.
The patrol was overwhelmed very quickly, was unable to get situational awareness, was unable to get its bearing, was unable to fall back to a covered and concealed position.
One of them went down. Another rushed to his side and dragged him back to the cover of the SUV. Their position at the SUV was about to be overrun, so they did the only thing they could. Ran to a position that might provide better cover. Except for the smoke from the grenades and a few scrub trees, there was no cover and no escape. The soldier wearing the helmet camera went down. Soon the camera stopped moving and some of the enemy fighters came into view.
Now, you may remember this little incident as the time Trump feuded with the widow of one of the dead soldiers. Remember, that was like a big brouhaha in media. But the real scandal was that we were in Niger in the first place, and basically nobody knew about it. The question is why? How is it that we live in a democracy, yet we do not know a lot of what our government is doing in our name abroad? Well, as Marxists, we must always look for the economic factors underpinning our social and political structures. And well, friend of the show, Vivek Chibber, has the answer. He shows how American imperialism does not benefit the working class in the United States.
And not only does the working class not benefit from this imperialism, in fact, the working class is forced to foot the bill. Every time the United States uses its military, it's coming out of a general tax revenue to which workers contribute. But the benefits of the uses of that military, the benefits of the expansion into the Middle East, the benefits of the trade barriers being broken down do not go to those workers. They haven't gone to those workers. They have gone to the people who employ those workers. Workers, therefore, foot the bill of imperial expansion. They pay the costs. They do not benefit from the profits that come out of it. In other words, the basic principle of imperialism is exactly the same as the principle of domestic policy, which is the general population foots the bill. In other words, the costs are socialized, but the profits are privatized.
So there you have it. If the United States is doing imperialism and the imperialism only benefits capitalists while the massive costs are borne by workers, then by definition, the system has to inoculate the imperialism from democratic control. If there were democratic control over the imperialism, then rationally, the workers would exercise their democratic rights to either share in the benefits of imperialism or end it altogether in order to not bear the costs. Unless you think that this was just something that happened due to unseen forces, it was in fact a conscious decision taken by the US elites who built the empire. Friend of the show, Daniel Bessner, wrote a book about a guy named Hans Speyer, a German exile who fled Nazism and came to the United States and was one of the major players at the RAND Corporation, one of the most powerful national security think tanks. Simply put, Speyer was one of the men who built the US deep state, an apparatus that was consciously designed to be outside of any democratic control. Speyer, who considered himself a social democrat, was traumatized by the experience of Weimar Germany and its inability to stem the tide of fascism, so he decided that democracies were just not aggressive enough to do what needed to be done. So the people needed to be bypassed. Bessner writes, quote, besides permitting Speyer to exert influence, RAND, much of whose research was classified, enabled him to fulfill his program, born from witnessing Weimar's failure for governing during crises without the input of public opinion. Participating in classified research projects allowed social scientists like Speyer, if they so chose, to mostly bypass Congress, as well as peer-reviewed academic journals, popular publications, newspapers, television, and other public forums when offering policy advice. Classified research, in short, made it difficult for the public and its representatives to evaluate, censor, impact, or otherwise hold defense intellectuals accountable for their recommendations. By shaping RAND's social science division, Speyer helped institutionalize a system that empowered non-elected experts to influence policy without popular oversight. Although Speyer originally considered his participation in and advocacy for such a system discomfiting, he nonetheless insisted that, quote, the loss of the American A-bomb monopoly required American leaders to consider themselves to be called upon to sacrifice secretly their own cherished values, meaning democracy, in order to enable their countrymen to live with these values in the future. For the Cold War's duration, the experts would have to rule. Now, this reminds me a lot of the John Cena character in the new Suicide Squad movie. He's called Peacemaker, and he says something like, and I'm paraphrasing here, I just love peace so much, and I don't care how many men, women, and children I have to kill to get it. Now, of course, once the imperial structure was built outside of democratic control, it becomes very difficult to dismantle it through democratic means. The most famous recent case of this is the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, or the AUMF. It was passed just days after 9/11, and it's essentially put modern war outside of congressional control.
So basically what the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, the AUMF, people call it, what that does is Congress essentially abdicates its rights and responsibilities to authorize prolonged war. That resolution that was passed days after 9/11, in this climate of great fear and danger and insecurity, has not been fully debated or voted on since that time, which is quite incredible to think about. 80% of current members of Congress have never voted on this war. So this is something that is in place from a long time ago, and that various presidents, they've used the AUMF to continue and expand the scope of these wars.
Now, US presidents like Bush, Obama, Trump, even Biden probably have used the AUMF as legal cover to do, for example, drone strikes in places like the Philippines or Libya. And because we created this structure, the empire does all manner of things to undermine democracy at home. One obvious example is how it works to militarize domestic police departments.
Since 2005, the defense industry has spent over $100 million in lobbying efforts annually, partially to secure their interest in the domestic homeland security market worth over $20 billion in goods and services. Their contributions play a major role in maintaining a steady flow of militarized equipment to local law enforcement.
Certainly vendors, companies that manufacture the technology that the police are purchasing are profiting from this. The police, obviously, they're not in the business of profiting from private acquisitions.
Thank you to the comrades over at CNBC, of all places. Police departments now more and more resemble occupying forces within our own country, much like the ones who occupied Iraq and Afghanistan. The sector of capitalists who benefit from selling arms to the empire have turned to the domestic market for their goods. The costs, once again, as Vivek Chibber points out, are borne by the workers through taxes. And beyond that, almost from the beginning, the structures of empire began spying on Americans. This is from the Church Committee's report published in 1975, which outlined the CIA's top secret Operation Chaos, which was a program to spy on Americans as a way to subvert dissident groups.
In the process, the Chaos Project amassed thousands of files on Americans, indexed hundreds of thousands of Americans into its computer records, and disseminated thousands of reports about Americans to the FBI and other government offices. Some of the information concerned the domestic activity of those Americans.
Now, the CIA is bad always, but at least it was designed to be spying on people abroad. It was illegal for them to do that to Americans, but almost as soon as they started, it immediately boomeranged back to the home front. And of course, this was only ramped up during the war on terror with the Patriot Act, the Bush administration's illegal warrantless wiretapping program, and of course, the Snowden revelations. And here is our good friend, young Bernie Sanders, talking about it with his good friend, I guess, Piers Morgan.
Thank you.
And I want to bring in a man who's been against the Patriot Act from the very beginning. Senator Bernie Sanders says the government has far too much power to spy on Americans. Senator, this is just unbelievable, isn't it?
It is. I voted against the Patriot Act time and time again because I worried about giving the government incredible powers, and I'm afraid that all of the fears that I have turned out to be justified. Look, the bottom line is that the United States government now has phone records and other records of tens and tens and tens of millions of Americans who have nothing, absolutely nothing to do with terrorism. I happen to believe terrorism is a serious issue. I want our law enforcement people to be vigorous and aggressive in going after terrorists, but we can do that without undermining the basic constitutional rights that have made this a great and free country. So I hope that we revisit this issue of the USA Patriot Act and that we constrain what the government can do. So I want kids out there, and I want every American to know, that when you get on the telephone, the government is not going to have records of who you were talking to at what time you were talking. I don't want that kind of feeling to inculcate Americans that Big Brother is watching me.
Right, it's not just phone calls, though. It's emails, photos,
That's right.
video,
That's right.
audio, documents, connection logs, everything. I mean, what has been going on here in the name of terrorism investigation is so all-encompassing. It almost embraces every single aspect of every American's life online.
First CNBC and now Piers Morgan. What is happening? Now, democracy means control over the society's wealth and resources. But when it comes to the empire, a good chunk of its budget is totally secret. This is the so-called black budget. And this little excerpt is from a piece in Wired magazine in 1995. So it's been around for a while. It writes, quote, "It's the world's wildest high-tech toy catalog, the Pentagon's annual Dear Santa letter. It includes secret weapons programs with baffling code names such as Elegant Lady, Tractor Rose, Forest Green, Senior Citizen, Island Sun, and Blacklight, White Cloud, and Classic Wizard. These are the black budget programs that pay for spy satellites, invent stealth cruise missiles, tinker with LADAR, which is laser radar, and experiment on aircraft that change color and helicopters that evade tracking systems. Covering expenditures for intelligence and weapons research, the Pentagon's black budget is the most titillating portion of the massive classification program that has swelled almost unabated since World War II. The black budget is the government's illusory and tangled accounting of what it spends on intelligence gathering, covert operations, and less noticeably, secret military research and weapons programs. It admits to no easy calculation, but by estimates for those who watch it, the black budget may hit US $30 billion a year, a figure larger than current federal expenditures for education. It includes spending by the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and the military R&D. With program element numbers, obscured figures, and code names that read like Dadaist poetry, the details of the black budget are revealed to only a few select congressional committee members, and sometimes not even to them. A budget outside of congressional control and even knowledge is totally anathema to democracy. That is why it is in the best interests of regular people here at home to organize and fight to dismantle the empire abroad. Moreover, the fact that the empire, which more or less oversees global capitalism, makes it easier for capital to exploit workers at home by threatening to move jobs overseas in search of lower labor costs means that it is in the best interest of workers here and abroad to establish links of solidarity to resist this stuff. Often, there have been arguments made that workers in America have benefited from the empire, and that is the reason why they are relatively better off than workers in the developing world. But as Vivek Chibber points out, as the empire expanded dramatically in recent decades, with defense spending going up more and more and more and more wars, wages in America have remained flat. The empire is simply not good for regular people here, and it has to be dismantled.
That was great. And obviously, I agree with your thesis here. I want to add, though, that we've experienced so many of our civil liberties, like, have been violated, like rolled back, especially after 9/11. And as you're listing, like, let's review, as you're listing all of the ways in which the government is acting in an authoritarian way in regard to imperialism, I can't help but wonder why it is that the vociferous anti-vaccine mandate crew wasn't around to push back against this stuff. Like, for instance, the AUMF, essentially Congress doing away with what our system of government is really supposed to be about, like the checks and balances that are necessary in order to ensure that the executive branch doesn't have too much power. Congress got rid of that when it comes to war, and everyone just kind of sat back and took it. It's amazing. The black budget that you mentioned regarding the Pentagon, the fact that the Patriot Act was signed, the indiscriminate spying on ordinary Americans, all of that stuff is certainly more indicative of an authoritarian regime than getting people vaccinated because it's a public health concern. Like, it's just like, the more I think about what we've experienced in this country over the last several decades, but certainly after 9/11, we get fondled every time we need to take a flight. It blows my mind. But no, it's the mask mandates and the potential vaccine mandates that somehow come across as authoritarian. All these other freedoms that we sat back and gave away, not a big deal at all.
No. Yeah. I mean, there's something psychological about, going on about the sort of threats abroad. I mean, that's why they always play up the new threats. I mean, first it was the Soviet Union, even well after most rational, sane people understood that the Soviet Union was not going to invade the United States or do, anything like that. Like, the planners at the highest echelons kept on figuring out ways to pump up the threat. I mean, there was, there's a famous case in during the Carter administration in which there was this like shadow group of defense intellectuals that were publishing these alternative, intelligence reports about the Soviet Union's military capabilities and their intentions and things like that. Total fantasy, none of it based in any fact. There was the famous missile gap that Kennedy ran on, that they made fun of in your favorite movie, Dr. Strangelove, in which there was a mineshaft gap. I mean, they just play up these threats. I mean, then the war on terror was perfect, for this. I mean, that 9/11 did shake people here at home pretty dramatically. And now they got they tried to do the Russia thing for a while, but it's, it kind of didn't really get as much, it didn't get people's juices flowing as much as they wanted. So now it's China.
Yeah, I mean, as you're talking about this, I think that the distrust in institutions in America is certainly tied to all of these failed wars that have drained us of resources. We know that the US government lied to the American people about why we invaded Iraq in this preemptive war to begin with, right? And so, I feel, I'm of two minds when it comes to the people who are acting incredibly stupidly when it comes to the vaccine and the masks. On one hand, I get really frustrated, right? I think that's the initial reaction. But then on the other hand, when you think about how often Americans have been lied to by government officials, by these institutions, they don't believe anything. And I don't know how to fix that. Certainly there's not much in the short term. But I think what you say in regard to the resources that are being diverted to these endless wars that actually don't it's a redistribution of wealth. It's just like what I was talking about in my Decode segment last week. It's a way to funnel money from taxpayers to an elite few, socialize the losses, privatize the gains and profits. And here you have it. People are sick of it.
If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog, as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.